So this year's John Niparko Memorial Lecture is Nina Kraus, Dr. Nina Kraus, which probably doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. So Nina is a scientist, inventor, and musician who studies really the biology of auditory learning. She began her career measuring responses from signal auditory neurons and was one of the first to show that adult nervous system has the potential for reorganization following learning. Through a series of innovative studies involving thousands of research participants from birth to age 90, her research really has found that our lives and sound for better in cases of musicians or bilinguals or worse in terms of language disorders, concussion, aging, or in hearing loss really shapes our auditory processing. Dr. Kraus has invented many new ways to measure the biology of sound processing in humans that provide unprecedented precision in the indexing of brain function. Using the principles of neuroscience to improve human communication, she truly advocates for best practices in education, health, and social policy. Please join me in welcoming our John Niparko Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Nina Kraus, who will be presenting Sound Processing in Healthy and Hurting Brain, What We Have Learned from Music and Concussion.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. So I think we're going to get set up here, and at some point, the world of presentations is going to catch up to the things that we know, which is that you need to look at people and you need to move, and you get a lot of information from an individual. So anybody who might want to see what's going on up close, there are lots of seats up here, and I encourage you to kind of move on. So I get to talk to you about sound processing in healthy and hurting brains. What have we learned from music and concussion? And so said another way, how do music and concussion affect sound processing in the brain? And the question that I want to be asking throughout is, how does our brain construct a meaningful sonic world, our meaningful sonic reality? And importantly, what are the implications for cochlear implants? And I really have to say, I'm so honored really to be giving the Niparko lecture. He has been such an inspiration to all of us, and Kennedy's talk was just a testament to all of the things that can be accomplished. So our brain constructs a reality. Of course, sound has to enter our ears to our brain, and it is informed by what we know about sound, how we think about it, how we feel about it, how we move with it. And so we always have to think about hearing, not in isolation, but involving our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems in the brain. So you might assume that sounds are external to us and that it is our senses that enable us to hear. But the mind has to format reality before it can perceive anything at all. So, now we're kind of in the realm of philosophy, but in fact, a realm that can be informed by neuroscience, auditory neuroscience. And again, this idea of cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward pathways affecting our hearing. And we know this is the case because, for example, if I know how to play a musical piece, even when I'm not moving at all and I'm just thinking about the piece, if you put me in a scanner, you will see that the motor areas in my brain will be active. What we know about sound very much influences how we hear it. Once you hear a buzz and identify it as an alarm, you will always hear it as an alarm. I want to tell you about a person who received a cochlear implant later in life and was trying very hard to get to appreciate music as she did before she received her cochlear implant, before she lost her hearing. And so she was listening to music on the radio all the time in the car, and one day she had a revelation. she recognized that they were playing 8 days a week. And suddenly, it clicked into place for her, into her mind, into her sonic reality. She heard 8 days a week the way she always had. So, this is a little experiment with you. Tell me if you can understand this sentence. This is the sentence.
The juice of lemons makes fine punch.
Now hear it again. Right? What we know about sound very much influences how we hear it. So we have to make these sound to meaning connections, and this is what our brain does. This is what our hearing brain does. So we are going to be taking this idea of how we construct a sonic reality and look at it through the lens of sound processing in the brain. And how do we do this? We do it in my lab, which we call brain volts. We measure physiology, so we're just using scalp electrodes. We deliver sound into the ear and the brain and measure a response that we call the frequency following response. And the reason that you see a mixing board there is, you're a great group to understand that sound consists of many different ingredients. And the reason I have a mixing board is that we can really tell how good a job our brain is doing at making sense of these different components of sound. And it's not a volume knob. These are distinct processes. So let me tell you a little bit, because I know you will appreciate the different ways that we can look at sound processing in the brain. So we can look at what is the strength of the fundamental frequency. What is the strength? How does the brain process the harmonics of sound? And this is, of course, important when you're thinking about complex sounds like speech and music. Timing, tremendously important, and a strength for cochlear implants. Not only onset timing, but timing, for example, for all of the timing components that are present in a consonant-vowel transition. Timing and noise. How is timing affected by noise? We can look at accuracy because the response that we get from the brain actually physically resembles the sound that we play to the brain. We can correlate the two and do a stimulus to response correlation or a response to response correlation. For example, correlate the response in quiet with the response in noise and see how accurately the brain is processing this information. We can see how stable the response is from trial to trial. We can look at phase. And phase, of course, is just another side of timing to see how well the nervous system is able to construct these timing differences that are so important for making a sonic reality for ourselves. So one way of looking at sound processing in the brain is to think about, well, what is the effect of experience? Because our brain is in constant flux. And so what about music? I've been fortunate to be able to engage with the educational community, so we have been able to look at sound processing in the brain in school programs of music. So these are not programs that were designed by scientists. These were programs in the world existing, and we were able to go in and to figure out what impact does music making have on the hearing brain. And these were both, we looked at in-school programs, after-school programs, and group instruction. And we have learned that music strengthens sound processing in the brain, and specifically for the processing of the harmonics and for various timing aspects of speech. So, again, it enables us to better tell the difference in speech. Did I say bad or dad? These involve timing computations that the hearing brain has to make. We know that making music and these changes in sound processing in the brain track with better language skills. And again, I think of John Niparko and how he was very interested in these language and functional outcomes. Our ability to hear in noise. speeded brain development with making music, and importantly, we've learned that childhood music can strengthen the aging brain. So this is a really, really good investment. Importantly, the musician's signature. So remember, I said it was the representation of the harmonics and timing, actually is the same signature as the one that we need for language. So that's a wonderful coincidence. So if you have a child with a language delay, for example, you will see that the representation of the harmonics and timing is diminished. And importantly, making music, and it is making music, it's not just listening. You're not going to get physically fit watching sports. You have to make music. So it strengthens sound processing in the brain, and this is something that we can see, and it builds up across the lifespan. So, if we think about aging, one of the things that gets reduced is the brain's ability to compute timing, the hearing brain's ability to compute timing, as you can see with that white line, especially for consonants that are very fast in timing. But look at an older adult musician. You can see that the timing is in fact quite good. Other things that happen as we get older is the harmonics in sound become less represented, the response becomes less stable, and phase locking, this neural synchrony among auditory neurons, becomes reduced. Now, look at the older adult musician, and you will see that in all of these aspects of sound processing in the brain, you have strength. So, back to this question. Our lives and sound shape our brain, and I want to recommend a book. It's called Hearing Beethoven, and it was written by a Beethoven scholar, Robin Wallace, whose wife, when she was an adult, suddenly lost her hearing and eventually received a cochlear implant. So here's somebody who had been studying Beethoven and really trying to think about his deafness, and then he has a wife with a cochlear implant, and he was able to get all kinds of very interesting insights. He says that Beethoven did not overcome his hearing loss, he learned to work with it. He says, what Beethoven did remained fundamentally the same. He improvised, he sketched, he revised. There was no dramatic change, no before deafness and after deafness. There was only an ongoing refinement in his relationship to the piano, which itself was changing, as our cochlear implants do. And the best answer to the question, how did Beethoven do it, was the way he always did. So rather than envisioning Beethoven as a bird without wings or a fish out of water, we might think of him as a pilot flying safely without working navigational instruments, but with a deep bodily knowledge of how to steer an aircraft. So very much we hear with our brains. This is how we need our brains to construct our sensory reality. And I want to tell you a personal story, which is about my son Nick, who is a chef, and he has 3 restaurants in the New York area. And Nick is life-threateningly allergic to dairy products. Yet he cooks, he makes some of the finest custards, which I invite you to taste. But we think we've been calling Nick our Beethoven, because he has this sense. He knows cooking, and he knows how to think about the food that he makes. So music really is a jackpot. One of the reasons, I studied auditory learning, and music is a jackpot in engaging the cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward processes that we know are important for learning, auditory learning. So a few examples: cognitive, memory, we know, has a very tight connection with music, which is why we are increasingly using music as a therapy for dementia and for trying to help people remember. And we know across the lifespan that if you measure auditory working memory with standardized tests using speech, you find that musicians outperform non-musicians. And I'm not talking about professional musicians. I'm just talking about people who regularly engage in playing a musical instrument a few times a week. So Charles Lim has done wonderful work showing that when musicians improvise, they engage, of course, cognitive processes. Reward is tremendously important with how we think about hearing. Robert Satori has done beautiful work showing that dopamine is released in the limbic system of the brain, 2 different nuclei, when you're anticipating a point in a piece that is a musical climax, and also at the point in which the actual musical climax occurs. Dopamine is simply it's released by the limbic system. So this sound to meaning relationship occurs. Now, these are my 3 babies. Aren't they beautiful? And you know the expression, it's so good to hear the sound of your voice. Well, why is that? Even before you understand what somebody says, you have had years of sound to meaning connections, and these connections are emotional, and that's part of the experience of hearing. We looked at sound processing in the brain in response to a baby cry. So here, that white line is the sound of the baby cry. And what we saw was that in red, the musicians are better able to pick up on the complex timing, the portion of the cry that tells you, does the baby mean it? The non-musicians, on the other hand, were stronger than the musicians in picking up the simpler aspects of sound, which was the fundamental frequency. So there's a real cortical and cognitive efficiency, a neural efficiency, to use what it is that you have experienced and that you can make the most use out of. Sensory, we know one of our first studies with musicians was to see whether musicians would be better at integrating visual information with the auditory. And yes, of course, this was the case for music, which didn't surprise us, but it surprised us how much better the musicians were at integrating auditory and visual information when it involved speech. Motor. So I'm going to sit here for just a few minutes and talk about rhythm and sound processing in the brain with rhythm. So rhythm is important not only for music, obviously, but very much a part of language.
You're a cheat and a swindler. That's what you are. How can you do a thing like this? Build up a little boy's hopes and then smash all his dreams to pieces. You're an inhuman monster. I said good day.
Okay, so there's a lot of timing in speech. And we know that it's the rhythm of speech that helps us fill in the gaps in noise, which is hearing a noise is challenging for all of us, but especially for people with cochlear implants. We know that the better you are at discriminating different rhythms, the better your hearing speech and noise is. And when we looked at different kinds of musicians, we found that drummers, especially if they protected their hearing, were especially good at hearing speech and noise. And this is something, again, with standardized tests that you know very well, HINT and Quicksin. Across the lifespan, we see that musicians are simply, they outperform non-musicians at hearing speech and noise. In our work in school, these longitudinal studies, we started out with second graders who were matched for their hearing and noise ability. After a year of music and no music in these different groups, we saw no change. But after 2 years, we saw that there was a significant change in the ability to hear in noise in the kids who had undergone music training. Now, this also dovetailed with the changes that we saw in sound processing in the brain. You should know that we did not see changes after 1 year, only after 2 years. It takes time to change the brain. We can see the red waveforms are speech responses in quiet and noise in musicians, and you can see that the noise has hardly disrupted the processing of the speech. But in the non-musician, you can see that in noise, the non-musicians really take a hit. The work that Gavin Beitelman has done in reverberation, which is a kind of noise, he finds that musicians are simply better. Even as reverberation increases, they are better at hearing speech and noise. And importantly, they look at their sound processing in the brain. I love to just look at this objective measure. He looks at the harmonics of the frequency following responses and found that they were simply stronger in the musicians in the reverberating conditions. Work that Robert Zatorre has done. Again, if you looked at aspects of the brain that are active during speech and noise, when it's noisy and then when it's very noisy, you see that the musician is more or less activating the same parts of the cortex. And again, you can see that the non-musician, really takes a hit when it becomes noisier. So what about if you have a hearing loss? So if you are a musician and you have a hearing loss, but it's a mild, or at worst, a moderate hearing loss, overall, we still find that the musicians with the hearing loss are better at hearing speech and noise than the non-musician with normal hearing. And again, you can see it in the brain's response to sound. In that first graph, you can see that in noise, the strength of the fundamental frequency is greatly reduced in the person who is poor at hearing a noise with normal hearing. And you can see that the strength of the fundamental frequency is very strong in the musician, in both quiet and noise. So an aspect of music, we can train rhythm through making music, and I want to encourage you also to look into programs, digital music medicine that will train rhythm specifically, like interactive metronome. We've done quite a bit of work on that, and I encourage you to look at our website for more details about that particular interaction. But there are various ways of strengthening rhythm. So the rhythm of speech helps you fill in the gaps in noise, and rhythm in CI users is a strength. Hearing a noise is especially challenge for implant users. And so the idea is that rhythm training can help enforce and strengthen hearing a noise in people with a cochlear implant, and the science really backs this up. So again, staying with hearing a noise, the idea that getting hit in the head, a blast injury has been associated for some time with difficulty hearing a noise. This is true if you sustain a concussion through sports. We've shown this very clearly, again, in standardized measures of speech perception and noise, that speech perception and noise is impacted by a concussion. And of course, hearing in noise is one of the hardest jobs we ask our brain to do. So we know that there is a relationship, we knew this, between concussion and hearing a noise, and we also knew that hearing a noise tracks very well with physiologic measures of sound processing like the FFR. But what we didn't know was there a connection between sound processing in the brain and concussion. And in fact, there is. So we have been able to discover that sound processing in the brain, the FFR, will identify 90% of people who have a diagnosis of concussion and clear, it will identify 90% and will clear 95% of people who have not had a concussion. The FFR tracks with symptom severity. And again, because the stimulus and the response look so similar to each other, you can do a stimulus to response correlation and see that the individuals with a concussion have less accurate responses to time. Again, you can see that timing is delayed. And finally, the strength of the fundamental frequency is really very much the hallmark of a concussion. And importantly, after symptoms resolve, this physiologic measure also resolves. So this can really give us information about when an athlete is ready to return to play or return to learn. We have a grant where we are testing all 500 Division I athletes at Northwestern, pre- and post-season, males and females, and I expect in a couple of years we'll have some more answers. So I want to spend my remaining time just thinking about this question of what do speech and music sound like through a cochlear implant? Again, through this window, this lens of sound processing in the brain. And also we could look at the idea of individual differences, which is such a hallmark of cochlear implantation. So Michael Dorman has done a lot of work in this area where he has constructed sentences, so this could be an original sentence.
Thieves who rob friends deserve jail.
And you might have...
Thieves who rob friends deserve jail.
So he came up with different aspects of sentences, recordings, and he had patients who had one normal ear and a cochlear implant in the other ear. And so he was able to ask them, what does the hearing through the implanted ear, what does it most resemble like? What does it match in terms of these electronically modified sounds? And the differences are huge. So I'm just going to play a couple. So these are some of the matches.
The sun is finally shining.
His class was on Saturday.
Do you like camping?
This was someone who was a poor perceiver in noise. This is in Polish.
Na ulicy stoi stary samochód.
And this is a match.
Na ulicy stoi stary samochód.
And here's another person's match of the same.
Na ulicy stoi stary samochód.
Okay, so I think what you can hear, and what you already know, I'm not telling you anything new, there are huge individual differences in cochlear implant perception of sound. And when we look at the frequency following response, so the brain's response to sound, here is the response of an individual over time. And you can see that these two different people have their own neural signature. Of course they do, because they have different lives in sound, they have different genetics, they have we all have different sonic realities. So what we were able to do is record, this is the brain keyboard, we call it the brain keyboard. We recorded the brain's response to every single note on the keyboard. And because the brain response so much resembles the sound, we can play back the keyboard and really get a sense of what the speech and music sounds like for individuals. In other words, we can play the brain. So I want you to hear, these are three healthy people, and this is what their brain sounds like with a hard day's night. So that's one person. Here's another person. Quite different, right? And here's a third person. So, we all process sound differently. And of course, what we really wanted to know was what about in someone with a cochlear implant, which we have done a little bit of work on. So if you take a normal hearing person and you play back how their brain responded to these notes, you will hear. Right? In an individual with a cochlear implant, it sounds more like this. So in that upper octave, we're actually getting quite a bit of frequency resolution. And again, I think this probably speaks to individual differences, but it could very well be that in this particular patient, the electrode insertion is kind of scrunched into this higher frequency area, so that there's a lot of actually frequency distinction in that higher octave. So, I think that this challenges us to really think about how individuals can hear music and what sense that they can make out of it. So in wrapping up then, with music and concussion, it alters sound processing in the brain in very predictable ways. So when we look at different sound ingredients, we can see that with music, the strength of the harmonics and of timing is enhanced through the sound to meaning connections that happen with making music. With a concussion, we see that the fundamental frequency is affected by a concussion. So, how does our brain construct a sonic reality? We must always be thinking about how sound intersects with cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward processes. And I think we have to think about what is the science telling us about rhythm. Well, we already know that this is a strength for cochlear implant users, and that it could help hearing and noise, which is a challenge for cochlear implant users. So the idea of rhythm training directly through music and possibly through digital music medicine is something that the science supports. And finally, because making sense of sound is one of the hardest jobs that we ask our brains to do, we have to make computations on the order of microseconds. So of course, getting hit in the head is going to disrupt this process. We really can think about sound processing in the brain as a measure of brain health, a way of looking at the integrity of processing of sound. This is my lab, which we call Brain Volts. And these are our alumni, who are responsible for what I'm talking to you about today. And finally, I would like to encourage you, please, to visit our website, our magical website. And also, if you look under publications, every month or so, we write something for the Hearing Journal, which is for hearing clinicians and specialists. And so that's really, I hope you'll have a look at that. And you can go as deep as you want on the website by punching the different areas that you might be interested in. So thank you so much for your attention.